Aida Jobarteh is a Swedish ethnologist and researcher who studies the notions of blackness, race, and migration in connection to European borders. She's worked on issues related to the African diaspora in the cultural sector, mainly focusing on the role of artistic spaces as examples of structural barriers and opportunities. In this conversation, we focus on the Mediterranean Backway, a migration route from the Gambia to Europe, traveled mostly by young men looking for a better future.
Well, my name is Aida Jobarteh, and I'm now in my 4th year of my research. The project is about, well, there's so many different angles of talking about what the project is about, right? Like theoretically what it's about, or what kind of empirical examples do I bring in and such. But I usually say, like, the elevator pitch is usually it's about migration. It's about West African migration to Europe, very contemporary, but also with the kind of respect, or the kind of not forgetting about the history of migration and how migration has kind of formed the decision of why people migrate, particularly then from the Gambia. So the reason why I got so interested in this and wanted to kind of go deeper into the reasons of migration was because in Gambia around 2016, 15, there were a lot of young men that traveled to Europe through what in Gambia is called the Backway. And I myself am half Gambian. My father is fully Gambian, and I've myself traveled to Gambia a lot, lived there for a shorter period. Like the longest I've lived in Gambia is 4 months, so not so long. But I felt this kind of urge to go deeper into it and understand. I mean, it's not a difficult question, right? Like, people want to migrate. Why? There's nothing so much to understand. People seek for greener pastures. People live today in a globalized world and want to take part in the movement that everybody seemed to be kind of part of when they look at their phones, when a huge, great deal of people in Gambia have family, and if not family, good friends that are already established abroad. So I kind of wanted to go deeper into the presence of Europe in Gambia, and then to follow them on their journeys as they seek to get a foothold in Europe and live a more mobile lifestyle. So that was how it all started. And then, of course, when you do a PhD, you have to kind of limit yourself, right? And where do you go, and so on. So I ended up in Italy. And that is because Italy is the kind of gateway to Europe, especially when looking at the migration during the time that I'm studying. I'm interested in a time scope between 2014 to 2017, around that. So all the young Gambians that did embark on the Backway kind of found themselves in this other kind of world rupture, political ruptures in Libya, the Arabic Spring, the aftermath of the Arabic Spring in Libya, and also the Mediterranean Sea and the war in Syria and Afghanistan. All these different kind of huge political wars made the Gambian migrants kind of be mingled with these refugees coming from all over. And that puts them in a really, really, really kind of stigmatized position, because all of a sudden, as the legal discourse in Europe today is that if you're a Black migrant and then man, you are not actually welcome here right now, because we have too much other people to take care of, and that are the real refugees. So when I kind of got more into kind of, okay, I'm going to go to Italy because that's where they end up. That's where they kind of start their new journey in Europe, if they do survive the journey through Africa. And that's where, I guess, where the kind of notion of what it means to be a Black man, but also a Black migrant man, and like the intersections of masculinity, race, and also class in a way. Like if you look at the whole world has like different class systems. So we're looking at like a subaltern class or a global working class of working men that want to come and work in Europe. And all of a sudden they're not kind of needed. Yeah, I think that, I mean, many of the men, young men that I speak to, they say that we knew that it would be tough, but we didn't think it was going to be this tough. And the violence of the system is something that they did not consider, to the extent of how the violence delays their lives by so many years. They thought by now they would be working, paying taxes, doing things that are like worthy for like contributing to the society, to the host society, but also being able to make a living for themselves and to send money back home. So they do reflect on that this was really, really not what they had expected, although they did expect that it was going to be difficult. And of course, I can't like speak for everybody, but the people that I have been in contact with, and it's a quite qualitative studies. I've followed like maybe I would say 10 men over the course of 4 years, but then I've also had a lot of one-time interviews with people that I've met just once. So it's bigger, but at the same time, I want to focus on like these men, because also then by following them for such a long period of time, I can also follow how they reflect. And a person that I met 4 years ago was quite still hopeful 4 years ago, and said that in 2021 I will go back if I haven't made it. And now we're in 2022, and he's still in the very same situation he was when I met him. So I definitely see this kind of disappointment, but also shock, that they did not expect Europe to be like this. They did not expect Europe to have so many, for example, beggars on the street, and they didn't expect Europe to treat people the way that they are being treated. And the hostility and racism is part of their everyday life, and it's kind of part of the systemic procedures they have to go through with lawyers and their asylum processes. But it's also very much spoken about like in society, how people avoid sitting next to them on the bus. And here I think there's kind of a mixture of being Black, male, and migrant, and how you are so singled out when you kind of have all those identity categories on you, kind of. I mean, you're not born like that. It's society that creates you. And I can say that these men, there's a blackness that has been applied to them layer by layer the further they move away from Gambia. So their blackness kind of, first they're Black in Libya, and there you have the North African or Arabic racism towards Blacks. So that's one kind of blackness. And then in Europe you have another kind of, so they have all PhDs in how it is, like the intersections of race, blackness.
This route that you're describing, is it usually the same? They get out of the Gambia. Can you describe what is the route for one of these men or for these men?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the route that I am looking at is I mean, in Gambia they call it the back way, but when I have now gotten more and more into it, I've decided to call it the Mediterranean back way, because of the specific route that ends up in Libya and goes over the Mediterranean to usually Italy, sometimes from Morocco to Spain. And the route goes through, I have the map over here. So from Gambia, they go to Senegal and then to Mali. Some also pass to Mediterranean. Then from Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and then Libya. So, and there are a lot of course, checkpoints, and there are a lot of different kind of geopolitical obstacles that they have to face. And they can meet everyone from helpers to smugglers to traffickers. And finally, in Libya is kind of where it's very systemic. Like they will be sold to these different detention camps, or they will be at the different kind of waiting stations by the coast where they can work, or they try to kind of gather money. Some maybe call family for the last boat money, and then they are pushed, as they say, they push us to sea. So yeah, that's the route is very, it goes through those countries that I mentioned, and ends up in Italy, Lampedusa. Some ended up in Cagliari in Sardinia, and others in, and then they are taken to different hotspots all over Italy. Hotspots is kind of quick fix system of the European asylum system to quickly kind of spread them to different stations. And these hotspots can be like run by the government, but they can also be private owned. And in the private owned, there have been many cases of kind of maltreatment of migrants.
Is at this time, well, I suppose that in the period that you're studying more so, is Libya still this hub of migration from sub-Saharan Africa? Is it still like this?
Well, I since I'm so specifically focused on Gambia, I can say that we talked about images, right, and how people look at images that kind of tempt people to go, and they follow people on the journey, and they're going to Europe, and they see the success story of Europe. But likewise, Libya, as it became increasingly dangerous for migrants to be at. I mean, the CNN reported in 2017 about slave markets, and I'm sure, I don't know, you can go back into that later. But those pictures slowly also came back to Gambia as scare stories rather than success stories. So people are not traveling to the same extent, that route going through Libya, as they kind of have now learned that was too dangerous. But people are still seeking other ways. It's like this philosopher, Trine, now I don't remember her name, but show me a wall, a 10-foot wall, and I'll show you a 10-foot 10 ladder. There will always be kind of this, people will always seek ways to be mobile. So maybe the answer to if people are still traveling to Libya to the same extent, I can only kind of speak from Gambia. No, and I'm guessing maybe even from Senegal, but I don't dare because I don't have those numbers. But Libya is still very much a place where refugees and migrants are being held. And the securitization of borders have really been, they've been increasing lately. So people are not coming as much through the Mediterranean because right now they're just being returned to Libya. And put through these so-called voluntarily return programs, where they're, rather than being helped on the Mediterranean to Europe, they are remote controlled straight back to where they started. And that's especially people then from Gambia, because Gambia is not a country that has like a direct war. So Libya is harder. It's a harder gateway now than it was.
Before going, I'd like to go a little bit into the bureaucratic system here in Europe and how you see that. But you mentioned this progressive acknowledgement of blackness, or this construction actually of being black, right? Do you want to talk a little bit more about that and how that works then once they're here? Because for many people don't think about it like that, right? That becomes black the farther you are from Africa, right?
Yeah. the blacker you get. Yeah. And I mean, that it's something that I'm kind of exploring with right now, because I mean, blackness, like you said, it's a construction, and the gaze, it's constructed by the gaze and who is looking at you. And to put it simply, different people have been looking at, let's take one man, a Gambian man. So he travels, and he never really thought about his skin color as being raised and being structurally restricted because his blackness. He was maybe more thinking about that he's immobile because he's born in Gambia, and Gambia is not, it's not on the top list of getting visas. So he's maybe tried every other way to get an invitation in, but he's restricted. But he wants to be mobile, and he leaves. But I don't think this kind of what do you call it, like self-awareness of how his actual race is also going to restrict him in the future is so present at the time. But then when he gets to Libya, for example, many have said to me that they were very, very, very surprised because in Libya they're Muslim, but they still were not treated as Muslims. They were treated worse than dogs. And here, for me, that was very clear, like, okay, well, what is it then that differs them? They're men, they're Muslim brothers. What is it that differs them? Yeah, it's their blackness, it's their race. And they say that also, us blacks suffer in Libya. So there you have like the first gaze, which is that kind of the norm in Libya, that you have black people as less worthy. And they talked a lot about these kind of gangsters that were even kids. Young kids were kind of taught to call them certain names, boss them around, and stuff. So here it seems like a reflection of their race was really, really present when they started going into how it was in Libya. But then also, I mean, when you come into the legal system, I guess it becomes a little bit more diffused, because it's not like, oh, you can't get an asylum because you're black. But at the same time, there's this collective story that many of them retell, which has to do with their blackness. So, and I mean, it can also be their ethnicity. So what is the difference between ethnicity and race? And I would say that it's really crucial to separate them, but at the same time also see them for that it's different. Because, for example, a black Ethiopian who is politically more kind of, he has maybe a higher chance of getting an asylum because he can refer to the political situation in his home country. Then his ethnicity of being Ethiopian will kind of win him the green card or the asylum. Meanwhile, from Gambia, your ethnicity of being from Gambia is not, or your nationality is not. But they're both black, and they still can both talk about how it is to be black. And I also think I'm still kind of on the elaborating a little, exploring with it. But then the history of race and the history of African blackness becomes an important way of kind of looking at it from like a theoretical perspective, because the awareness of being black in Europe seems very present, and they refer to Bob Marley, they refer to a lot of like artist quotes from how it is like to hustle as a black man, or taken from Africa, stolen. And there's a lot of kind of self-awareness of how it is to be black. And they also refer a lot to black slaves. So there's kind of like an identity process also going on, where the inheritance of being racially discriminated by European or by the white system or capitalism or systemic violence is very present when they reason for their suffering. And I guess when you're migrant without papers, it becomes so crystal clear, because their situations and their camps lives and their exploitation is so extreme. They work on fields picking tomatoes for very, 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 very little. They live in not all, but the ones that are really working as seasonal farmers, they're very, very much kind of systematically excluded from society.
I'm curious about how on this side, right? Because Europe has had a Black population for a long time, right? But unlike other places, like, you know, obviously North America or even South America, I think there's still a long way to go before we can talk about the Black European identity and what that means, and, you know, having its own symbols and whatever. So I'm curious if, when they get here, these people that you've been following, how do they see Black presence in Europe, people who are already here? And is there some kind of movement towards identifying with them? And how do those kind of like conflicting, right, experiences, how do they touch each other?
I think what's really important to remember when talking about European Blackness is class, because I mean there are black Europeans have been there have been Black Europeans for so long, and we can talk. There's this Afropolitan, the notion of being an Afropolitan, and we have Black people in the diaspora, or Blacks that are born here in Europe, that have established businesses and that are basically Europeans, and their race is less a problem because they have the capital of speaking fluent European languages. They have the capital of moving around in, like, their bodies become an extension of the societies they're in. Meanwhile, because they are Europeans, but they're Black Europeans, and they can also sometimes, I feel like sometimes Western Blacks can also capitalize on their, you know, on their race in a way. Of course, I'm not saying, of course, there are still structural barriers, but I can even take myself as an example. Like in today's society in Stockholm, in Sweden, there's a lot of focus on diversity, and I can, you know, put the race card. Oh, I have this, you know, I'm half from Gambia, and I'm, you know, multicultural and such. But this is something I can do because, okay, I'm half white and I'm born and raised here, and but it's hard. So then all of a sudden we're talking about like more about class, and the group that I'm studying, they are very far from having that Afropolitan capital or this kind of Black Europeanness, because they are kept away from ever settling. So they are kept being hard, like not really learning the language. They're kept from getting a work experience. They're kept from, they're in a way not really arrived yet here. So I feel like it's such a, the notion of Black Europeanness is very huge, and it's not at all like a it's not a, what do you call it, like a general group. It's not a homogeneous group. It's very, very different depending on so many factors. And I think class is one kind of, if not, gender, but, or all of them, the intersections of the many. So, and I think this is because I'm an ethnologist, right? So ethnologists, like my thesis is going to be an ethnological thesis, and we like to dig into smaller groups, into the everyday life. I've followed a group of people for a very long time to kind of shed light on bigger structures, and then it becomes very hard to generalize. So I can speak on like out from the research that I've been doing so far, but I can't speak for everyone. And maybe the group of people that I have studied, you know, none of the ones that I've studied, for example, they have gotten out of the system. They have not gotten like a proper paper. But so I'm kind of speaking for the very, very marginalized group. And I think the way to a more established position in society is very long for that group in comparison to like the overall Blackness community. But I'm sure there are bridges.
What is the so we've gone through the route, right? So Libya, mostly Italy and Spain. So once these men arrive in Italy, can you go through the steps, kind of the bureaucratic steps that are in place?
I mean, the bureaucratic step is it's very, very complicated. And I would say time is what defines it. Very like step by step, they will come. They will be rescued, citation mark, and their fingerprints will be taken, and then they will be taken off to an asylum center somewhere. And these are called hotspot systems, or like hotspots, where they then have to go through a process of applying for asylum. And in the case of most of the Gambians that I've interviewed, this is where it kind of stops. They get pretty quickly rejected because they are not coming from a country of war. But then we have to keep in mind that some of these men did leave Gambia during the former president Yahya Jammeh in the Gambia, and he was a dictator. And some actually did leave because of political reasons. But then it becomes very kind of simple for the European system to say, well, now he's gone, so you can go back. There's a democracy now. There's kind of a very, very paradox in that kind of way of just being able to, oh, now I have to go back. They don't take into consideration of the depth that this man is in, the expectations the family might have on him because he has arrived. That is something that is out of the question for this man. So he will try again. And when he then tries again, he will get another denial. And some people that I've spoken to have gotten up to 4 to 5 kind of denials over the course of 4 years, 5 years. So he can either then continue and appeal, because that is his right, while he is kind of appealing with a lawyer who is not paid by him because he's not able to make any money. So it's a typical kind of a lawyer who gets paid by the government to take the asylum cases. And a lot of them have kind of said that, oh, they make money on us, kind of. They feel that there's this whole system that pays so many paychecks for us to never get through. I mean, you can see that from their perspective and say, yeah, there is a whole system. There is an industry of this, and people are making money of it, and that's a fact. But so the men that I'm interviewing are in the unfortunate situation that they will not be accepted, but they keep on trying. But of course, because it's extremely, I mean, what happens to you when you're just never moving? It's like being in jail. They feel like they're growing younger. They're being kind of, they're there meant to be men taking big steps, and then they're just being kind of infantilized and stuck. So and a choice they have is to move and to try to escape, find another place, move, and travel to other countries, travel to other European countries. Some have done this and managed to live a year or two maybe in other European countries, but then they are usually deported back because of this fingerprint Dublin regulation, which in short means that the country that took your fingerprint when you arrived in Europe is the country that will deal with your asylum processes. But there are so many loopholes in this system, and it's in the loopholes that they can maybe try to make some kind of living, which is, for example, go to Italy, now go to Germany, go to another European country. And in that way, all of a sudden, they become involuntarily mobile. So they were in Gambia being stuck and felt like involuntarily immobile. And then they come to Europe and they're forced to be involuntarily mobile. They have to try their luck in another place, maybe let's say Germany. And then they are still deported. So they're forced back to Italy, or they're forced back to Italy just to process their case, to then go back to live in Germany because they managed to find a job there instead. So it's this, they never really get to settle.
When you talk about fingerprints, are we talking, just to get specific, just fingerprints, or this the whole biometric profile that's being taken as well?
Yeah, I mean, the biometric profile has really expanded, and the fingerprint is the main kind of bio proof and kind of what keeps them. And I can quote one of the participants saying, the fingerprint is like a jail. So it's like the body becomes your jail because I am the person I am in my own jail of not being able to move. But because of the kind of the asylum laws and the whole EU regulations with much stricter rules after their 2015 and the influx of migrants and refugees coming in 2015, they have put in many other measurements, or what can I call it, biometric measurements, as kind of figuring out their age. So the fingerprint is something you cannot get rid of. So it's kind of the securest way of tying people to certain places. But also, if you're an underage, you have a higher chance of getting a visa. And of course, people will try to manipulate with that. I'm not here to kind of call out and say, oh, they are manipulating. I'm here to problematize the fact that people have to manipulate and lie to kind of escape death. But so they have this to measure their bones and their teeth to kind of figure out what age they are and if they've been lying about their age.
There seems to be this overlapping of jurisdictions when it comes to processing these people, right? So how do you have some visibility on that? So there's the European kind of like space, and then there's the Italian sovereignty and their own laws, and then south of Italy also has its own specificity. How does that work in terms of making all of this work, right? To process these people and to keep these people like this?
I think it is a jungle. I can only speak from kind of the participants' experiences. I have not gone in to study the different laws. I have not gone in to become an expert on like EU regulations when it comes to migration policies. But I have, of course, tried to I need to contextualize the whole of Italy and the EU laws. So of course and I like what you said about the overlapping of rules is so present in the material, because changes happen all the time. And even just to take Italy as an example, just during the period where I've been interviewing, they've changed the rules. The former Salvini decree, he took away this humanitarian protection visa, which was that everyone that applied would get a 2-year protection visa, which was better because they could work, they had a better conditions. That was just put into place again now, but for 2 years during my fieldwork, it was taken away, which meant that a lot of people just stood without papers and had a really big fright of being deported or homeless and such. So and then the pandemic, and then, there's so many ruptures all the time that affect the politics and that affect the kind of the small areas and the countries. And Italy, like you said, is very divided, and they have like the north and the south, and the rules, it seems, in the south, and also the who can influence the rules seem to be a lot more kind of hard to track down in the south. I'm speaking to one man who's been working. I followed him like through all the seasons, and it seems like there are no rules for him at all. And then the kind of you become subject for exploitation, which is then in one way the system that pushes people to become so vulnerable to the system. And it's very, I mean, I feel like Italy is it's so extreme because they're left alone in a way. They're not, they are in Italy, but when I kind of want to look into the problems of migration, I want to emphasize that this is a European problem, and that if every European country did go in and take their part, it wouldn't be such a, and I like citation, burden for Italy, because Italy being geographically so close to the Mediterranean, they were the ones to have the biggest kind of numbers coming in at the time. But where were the rest of the so-called union then, the European Union? So I of course need to kind of look into the different contexts of the asylum centers in Italy, and I've also come across 2 asylum centers that happened to come out in the news when I was there because of corruption. So you have these 2 huge asylum centers that managed to get millions of euros of the European Union on the behalf of all these migrants. And then they talk about how Africa is so corrupt. Like it becomes, I didn't even believe it that this happened, because it was so much money, and the migrant men that was kind of living under the house of this organization, they were both negatively and positively affected by this corruption, because he could just make his own rules and pay, but then he never processed their cases. And now we know that's because he needed them for his farm, this owner of this asylum center. It's complicated. It's a lot of different processes that I've kind of been exposed to through this. There are flaws. I would call the system flawed.
At the very least.
At the very least.
In the stories that you've been telling, there's an absence of women, right?
Yeah.
Where are the women in all this journey in the Gambia and then in Italy? How is their presence and their absence felt?
Yeah, good question. I mean, because I decided to write and research the migration from the Gambia and the particular route, the back way, which I now call the Mediterranean back way, there are very, very, very few women. And I haven't actually myself met any women that have traveled through the back way. I don't have the numbers, but it's a very masculine journey. And one of my theoretical frameworks is then masculinity and Black masculinity. So that's for Gambia. That doesn't mean that women do not travel out of Gambia. Women also do migrate, but they take safer routes. There are other ways of coming to Europe. You can overstay your visa. There are other routes that are safer. But because I'm geographically kind of focused on the back way and the phenomena of back way, why it became so big, why people went on that particular journey, I have a very masculine, like a gender perspective of men. But I did come across 2 women in Italy, but I didn't interview them. We just chit-chatted a bit and I was at an abandoned house. A lot of the migrants that have been processing their asylum so many times that they now kind of get kicked out and live as undocumented and have no case going for them. Some live in these abandoned houses, and I was waiting for one of the participants to come, and then I sat and talked a bit to a woman. She was from Nigeria, but I mean, and we also, I don't know, there are from what the participants have said when I asked them, like, oh, but why do you think no women go? And why there's this is a man's journey. This is not for men. But knowing that a lot of women do go on this journey, but they are traveling, they are like fleeing war, for example. They are, being scared of, like, they're really running away. And also in many of the women from Nigeria, there's the whole prostitution industry. I don't know how much you know about that, and I'm not the expert to go into it, but there is a whole industry of women, Nigerian women, being kind of told to go, promised a lot to go, and are kind of stuck in Europe and have a kind of a pimp who controls their prostitution and such. But that's kind of a different kind of migration and not the one that I'm studying. It is a very masculine site. Even when I'm around at the places, there are many men because of the hard nature of this particular journey. And this is also kind of what stigmatizes them, because they become part of this huge group of men that politicians today say, these are not refugees, these are not, these are economic migrants that came here to work. And I have one participant who said, and I quote, yeah, I'm an economic migrant, and so fucking what? And in a way, I think it's an interesting aspect, because we need to stop. One thing is that we need to stop dichotomizing refugee and migrant, but we also need to problematize why the term economic migrant is so unwanted. We need to disarm the economic migrant, because he's just another man who finished school, saw no option in his countries, and wanted to travel to find a job, just like a lot of men here in Sweden that happen to be white and privileged with a passport. So I think it's really important not to just try to move away from the term economic migrant, because we're living in a global world where everybody wants, economic prosperity in some way to take care of themselves and their families. And the whole of Europe was built on the Europeans once traveled to Africa to gain their fortune. So
you spoke about this global world, and then since you, in the period that you're studying, right, and
yeah.
Especially recently, we've gone through a couple of global shocks, right? These years of the pandemic, and now the situation in Ukraine, which is kind of unavoidable to bring to the conversation. And how do you see, specifically in these last 2 years, the evolution of what you've been looking at, given these two massive events?
You mean the pandemic and now the world in Ukraine, and how that in a way relates to the topic?
If that had a specific or unique effect on their experience and what you've been looking at?
Definitely, yeah.
First with the pandemic, and more recently now with this. And I ask this obviously because what's happening in Ukraine has brought to light these contradictions that you've been talking about, right? That again, these so-called dichotomies between economic migrants, war refugees, who gets to be welcomed and integrated, and so how has that like reflected not only, I think my question is more of how people, these people or people in their position could look at these events, right, and see their lives reflected.
Yeah, for sure. There are a lot of they really do reflect. I mean, if one thing, the people that I speak to are very like informed about what's going on in the world, I mean, I would say there are three huge happenings, and that is, like you said, the pandemic, but also Black Lives Matter, and then now Ukraine. And to start with the pandemic, their lives were directly affected because in Italy, which was one of the hardest hit countries, their processes just went on standstill. So there was a huge delayment in every aspect of the bureaucratic system, jungles that they were in. A lot of them who did kind of had found a way to be mobile and travel to Germany, work there for a bit, come back, continue their cases. They couldn't do that anymore either. And then you had the interesting aspect of migrants being promised residency if they worked, because all of a sudden the borders were closed because of lockdown, and they couldn't get the usual pickers like from the other European countries that are legally traveling in to do that work. And like the irony, right? Like, yeah, we just keep you in these camps, and when you're needed, then you can come. So this kind of reserve labor. And also just small things, like, again, me focusing on the little things. When I remember I had to turn to remote methods. I couldn't travel to Italy myself. So I called one of the participants, or all of them. We had a lot of phone interviews like the one we have now. And he had snuck out because he just could not bear being inside. And then we're talking about 7 men living together in 2 rooms. And I do know that there are a lot of Italians that also suffer and live really cramped. But the particular situation of the migrants were that they usually do live extremely cramped and share bed with together, and the conditions of like human integrity and just being able to have privacy was extremely tested during that time. But then on to the pandemic, the Ukraine. There's, of course, like when it happened, I couldn't help like, oh my God, this is really so. This is what I study, and now it's happening. And I mean the conditioned hospitality is extremely provocative for me, and also for them, and to kind of, this is nothing new for them. I have one of the ones that is participating, I'm also friends with on Instagram, and he was putting up a lot of kind of, we're all, now you see, this is how the European borders really are. This is our life, and we're all human. We're all one race. And when is this going to end? So they were very like, they saw what was happening to the students in Ukraine that are Black, and how all European countries now are kind of opening their arms in a way that's grotesque. Here in Sweden, you have playlands, like these jumping castle yards that are saying all kids from Ukraine can come here and play as much as they want, and all people from Ukraine can travel on the bus for free for 2 years. And this is just a few years after we had race profiling police running around in the subways to find undocumented refugees. And then, of course, race become so there's your uniform. Brown and Black people are profiled, and that's a fact. But it just becomes very clear that sympathy is conditioned, and yeah.
The third event that you spoke of Black Lives Matter, how did that impact
the Black Lives Matter was there was a lot of activity among almost all the participants, because it was during a pandemic, and not funny enough, but the pandemic was not something that I felt was something that they felt was a threat. They have traveled through Libya, they have traveled through the Mediterranean, they have been facing death so many times, and then here came a cold that was supposed to kill them. At the same time, they saw it as a threat when they saw what it did to society and what it did to the elders. But them as a group, we all know that the coronavirus is not so dangerous for young, healthy beings. And this group, they are young, strong, healthy beings. So for them to feel so kind of restricted and stuck in their situations because of the pandemic was almost a little bit absurd. And then the Black Lives Matter felt, for me, it felt like it was, they could take it to the street. And when they had their posters, it said Migrant Lives Matters, because Black and migrant can be the same. And they also talked about how it's interesting that some Black Lives Matter, rather than where were your demonstrations when we all died because of the same racist system, when our brothers died in the Mediterranean Sea. And it's something, of course, that I couldn't, because I'm so like in that discourse of when does a life matter, and Black Lives Matter is also a very Western Black Lives Matter, and Western Blacks have the more power than migrant Blacks. But here came this huge movement that kind of united the two, because after all, it is all about systemic violence. And the systemic violence is something that they could testify to, and they have also done in the interviews with me about violence of the police, violence of border guards. So it was something that was very, very interesting. Especially two of the men that I was interviewing was all out demonstrating and sent pictures and such about that he was out and wearing a big mask and having, but kind of advocating for that it's Black migrant lives matter.
Going back to this reality that we're talking about, young men in the 21st century, and so they have a mobile phone, I'm guessing. And
yeah.
How do you see their use of digital technology, of networks, you spoke of Instagram, I'm sure that WhatsApp, communication networks, because that also brings, it's different from previous migration histories, right? These are networked people. So how do they make use of this communication power, let's call it like that, in the position that they're in?
It's extremely important to their phones. It's extremely important, like you said, from it's sparking interest to travel, but also to keep in touch with people. So their network is huge, and they have this. I'm right now working a little bit with the term community of knowledge, which was not coined by me, but like there's this whole community which is online, and that's where the knowledge really is. That's because it's from mouth to mouth, and it is also about like how to navigate, where to go, where to travel, and that would not be possible if it wasn't for the phones, and then mainly WhatsApp. I feel like is something that I don't know, has been much more used, and using voice instead of writing. Voicemail has been, like, I feel like Africans have been using that much more than Europeans, maybe because it's been so important to keep in touch in that way through networks. And I would say that even I think one thing that I'm interested in is also how the reconstruction of life in Europe now is being made. But I have not gone in to follow their except one that I'm friends with, but to follow and analyze what they post, because it's their kind of, there goes the limit of their privacy in a way. Then I would have to get consent, and then they would have to feel comfortable with it, because your identity is a lot what you put online. So I have chosen not to follow what they post, because I also do know that there is, you can look at it problematically and saying, why don't you post about the hardship? Why don't you write and express the hardship? There are a lot of people that do it, but it's not been like my focus. But I have seen, I mean, I'm in a lot of groups on Facebook, and there are a lot of migrants from Gambia that have gone through this route, but they're not my interview people that I'm interviewing, but they're out there showing what it is, and kind of advising people on how to navigate in the asylum system in Europe. But I think that their phone is very much what's helped them to navigate and to communicate with different people on different spots through WhatsApp mainly. It would not be possible without.
Thinking about this notion of fault, right, and fracture, if you had to guess, how do you see the European Union dealing with these old stories on the one hand and these new stories now? 2 to 5 years looking forward, how do you see this story evolving?
Oh, I'm not very hopeful, but I mean, I would call the whole kind of asylum system very fractured, and fractured beyond repair, I would say. At the same time, what is being, I don't know, maybe we can only hope that there's some kind of humanitarian, on a more like humanitarian based mentality, and that could kind of go in and repair the system. I just feel like it's having now studied this for so long, I feel like it's really difficult, and it also has to do with politics and the ways of right-wing populism in Europe today. I think that is unfortunately just going to be more and more fractured, and which makes the lifelines of these men that I'm studying also a very fractured lifeline. I'm working a little bit with this kind of, you have a life script. And Sarah Ahmed, she's a phenomenologist. She works with like that life script, and that you plan your life as a line. But then all these things happen, and it becomes like a queer line instead. So I think the notion of queer and fracture can kind of relate a little bit to one another. It's not straight, and you know what's happening, you know what's coming. It's more scattered. It's broken. And I'm looking into how it even goes into loops, like it goes up and around and back, and they're being in like this notion of temporality. They're stuck in time in a way, in this bubble of not moving forward. And I don't see that the system will change either, because as we know today, we've had, so like you said, so many political happenings. I feel like we're living in a time where there are a lot of war going on. There are a lot of political instability in Europe too. We're not only looking at the global South anymore as a place of chaos or a place of corruption and war and famine. Europe is a place of famine. Europe is a place of war. And what I hope is that, of course, it's easy for me to say because I have grown up very privileged, but I hope that it can, that because Europe is so scattered right now, I hope that people can maybe try to find that greener pasture within their closest areas, and if they do travel safe, because there are so many lives that are lost through this journey, and also lives that are wasted, that are kind of almost ended, although they're still living. And one person said, I feel like I'm already dead.